So in these videos, we'll be talking about the autonomic nervous system. This first image here is showing you the somatic motor nervous system, so not the autonomic. So it's showing you a sensory neuron providing afferent information moving through the dorsal root of our spinal nerve with an interneuron that is going to integrate or process the information. Notice that the interneuron is in the central nervous system, either in the brain or spinal cord. And then it's going to impact one motor neuron, one somatic motor neuron. Notice that its cell body is in the central nervous system. Its axon is going out the ventral root of our spinal cord, and it is going to impact an effector. And here the effector is skeletal muscle because we're talking about our somatic motor neurons. Autonomic motor neurons are going to be a little different. Autonomic motor neurons are going to have two motor neurons. So there's the one sensory neuron, one interneuron, that then communicate with two motor neurons, or a two motor neuron chain. So let me show you a picture of what this looks like. Here we have, so it doesn't show you the sensory neuron this time, but it's showing you the motor neurons only. So these are just the motor neurons. And you don't see the interneuron either, but we can just draw an interneuron somewhere right there. And what this is showing you is that there are two motor neurons. And so we call them a preganglionic neuron. That's the one that's closer to the spinal cord. And then a postganglionic neuron. The preganglionic neuron, the cell body is going to be within the central nervous system. And then the postganglionic neuron, it's called a postganglionic neuron because it's after the ganglia. Remember that a ganglia just means cell bodies. So it's really like gray matter and white matter, and ganglia is peripheral nervous system specific. And then our postganglionic neuron is going to innervate an effector, and here it's going to be a voluntary effector. So this is showing you an example of smooth muscle. Could also be some sort of gland, for example. So here it shows the whole picture. Here we have a sensory neuron and this is showing a visceral sensory neuron providing information from the gut, for example. The sensory neuron cell body is in our dorsal root ganglion. It's going to innervate an interneuron that's going to process the information. Notice it's in the central nervous system. And then we have a two-chain preganglionic neuron with the cell body in the central nervous system, impacting a postganglionic neuron with its cell body in this ganglia right here. And then it innervates this smooth muscle or glandular tissue. The sympathetic division is one division of the autonomic nervous system, and its preganglionic neurons are going to be found in the thoracic and lumbar areas of the spinal cord. And that's why it's also called the thoracolumbar division. So the postganglionic neurons are going to be found within those ganglia that I just pointed out, and those are called sympathetic ganglia. Lower ones that are going to impact the digestive area are called collateral ganglia, and this also includes the splanchnic nerve. Some of them also innervate the adrenal medulla, and the adrenal medulla secretes epinephrine, and that's what gives, it's kind of also known as adrenaline, which is what gives us that fight or flight response. So here is an image that shows you the sympathetic division. We have our spinal cord, we have our ventral dorsal root, we have our sympathetic chain ganglion, and that is going to hold the cell bodies of our postganglionic neurons. As we move down into the abdominal region, these are called collateral ganglia. So here shows an image of our sympathetic division, and here it shows a preganglionic neuron in red, and then a postganglionic neuron. And as you can see in the lower regions of the abdomen that are innervating the intestines, the abdominal region, these sympathetic chain ganglia are further out, and they are called collateral ganglion. Our preganglionic and postganglionic fibers are going to split or converge. So our preganglionic fibers branch out like this one right here. And that is so that the preganglionic fibers are actually able to synapse with a lot of postganglionic neurons by branching out. They'll be able to synapse with many more. Whereas postganglionic neurons receive input from a lot of preganglionic fibers. And so say this is one postganglionic neuron right here, receiving a lot of information from different preganglionic neurons. That's what convergence is. So divergence is the action of our preganglionic neuron, while convergence is the action of our postganglionic neuron and its ability to receive input from a large number of preganglionic axons. So this divergence and convergence is going to allow for mass activation, as in everything or almost everything kind of acting all at the same time, for kind of like that systemic fight or flight response. So you can see the collateral ganglion really well here, in the celiac and inferior mesenteric and superior mesenteric. These are just examples of collateral ganglion. They are different from the sympathetic chain ganglion because the sympathetic chain ganglion were the ones that were directly next to your spinal cord. The adrenal medulla is impacted by our sympathetic division. We know that our adrenal medulla produces epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are going to impact our sympathetic division. The parasympathetic in blue and the sympathetic division in red. Notice that the sympathetic division is in the thoracolumbar division, which is why it's called the thoracolumbar division. And the parasympathetic division comes from the brainstem and the sacral area. So it's also called the craniosacral division. And you can see it's coming from these cranial nerves, and we're going to talk about that. But one big thing to notice about the parasympathetic division versus the sympathetic division, we talked about with the sympathetic division how there is the sympathetic chain ganglion here. And then as we get lower, these are the collateral ganglion that are innervating the abdominal regions. But the parasympathetic, one thing to notice is that the preganglionic neuron is very long. So they have really long axons and they innervate really close to the target organ. So the preganglionic neuron is long. The postganglionic neuron, that's shown in these dashes right here, is short. And so what that means is that they have these terminal ganglia that are really close to the target organ. This is different from what we just spoke about with the sympathetic chain ganglion and the collateral ganglion. Sympathetic nervous system, in contrast, have shorter preganglionic neurons and longer postganglionic neurons. This image here is showing you the path of the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10, which is part of the parasympathetic nervous system in that craniosacral division. And you can see where it innervates. It's innervating the lung, the heart, the stomach, the liver, the mesentery, the small intestine, and portions of the large intestine. The sympathetic nervous system is responsible for our fight or flight reaction, and it does so by activating those target organs, but also by releasing epinephrine from the adrenal medulla. Norepinephrine is a neurotransmitter that's used here by the postganglionic neurons. And so we're going to talk about the neurotransmitters that are going to be used in the parasympathetic and the sympathetic divisions. But here we're saying the postganglionic neuron is going to release norepinephrine. This is going to increase our heart rate, increase blood glucose. It can cause vessel dilation or bronchodilation, and it'll allow for blood to go to our skeletal muscles and suppress our digestive function because it prepares our body for a short-term stress, like an emergency. The parasympathetic division is going to do the opposite of that, and it releases acetylcholine from postganglionic neurons. Acetylcholine, we've talked about that one before. And so it is largely antagonistic to the sympathetic division, which means it's going to do the opposite of what the sympathetic division does. Rather than increasing the heart rate, it will slow it, and it will activate our digestive activities and our urinary activities. So the parasympathetic and sympathetic preganglionic neurons, and so I'm going to draw a chain of neurons here. These are both motor neurons. Here is our preganglionic neuron. Here's our post. Both of them are going to release acetylcholine, both sympathetic and parasympathetic. But we just talked about what the postganglionic neurons are going to release. The postganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic division are going to release acetylcholine, and these are called cholinergic receptors. And sympathetic postganglionic neurons are going to release norepinephrine, and these are called adrenergic. A small amount of them will release acetylcholine, for example, the ones in skeletal muscle, blood vessels, or sweat glands. So this is just showing you an image that summarizes what we just spoke about. The blue here are our parasympathetic division. They are in the cranial region and the sacral region. The preganglionic neurons are long. They release acetylcholine, and so they're called cholinergic. The postganglionic neurons are short. They also release acetylcholine. The red ones are our sympathetic nerves, sympathetic division, found in the thoracolumbar division. The preganglionic neurons are short. They release acetylcholine, just like everything else, cholinergic. The postganglionic neurons are longer, and they secrete norepinephrine. These are called adrenergic. Notice this one is going to impact the adrenal medulla, and it causes the adrenal medulla to release epinephrine and norepinephrine. And remember that epinephrine and norepinephrine are also called adrenaline and noradrenaline, which is what gives us that fight or flight response. Epinephrine is made by methylating norepinephrine. So here we have some catecholamines. Notice that they all come from tyrosine, and I don't expect you to know the chemical formula for this, but it's interesting to see how epinephrine is just adding a methyl group, and that's what you get to that's how you make epinephrine. In the autonomic nervous system, postganglionic neurons have these swellings called varicosities, and it is from these varicosities that they are going to release neurotransmitter. And so here it shows a sympathetic neuron secreting norepinephrine, and again, this is a postganglionic neuron. Here we have a parasympathetic postganglionic neuron releasing acetylcholine with these cholinergic receptors, and they're going to have antagonistic effects. And so these are called synapses en passant. It's like synapses in passing, so that they can send synapses all along the length of an axon. But one big thing about this image here is that it shows how these are going to have antagonistic effects to each other. And so one may be excitatory while the other may be inhibitory.